Welcome to Ecologic for the month of August 2022. Beautiful time of the year, plenty of rain, probably more than we need, and I'll talk briefly about the flood of the last few days. Our guest is Jim Delahousie, uh, a friend of mine that fished with in the basin, camped with, and my brother was very friendly with him over the years, and they stayed in a houseboat in Bayou Pigeon. Belonged to old Mr. Rudd Gauchon. It was a beautiful old houseboat. I think it got destroyed by a hurricane event. But anyway, Jim's going to share with us what it was like before the great dredging of the late 50s, early 60s took place. And how it's changed over the years. And Jim knows because he's, after college and during college, he spent 10 years fishing in the basin. I think that's how he paid his way through school. So anyway, Jim, thank you for being here. Before we go into the history of the basin as we know it, going back to the 50s, and that's what we're talking about. I think Jim started college in 57 when I did.
That's right.
All right? And the great thing about college, you meet, friends who have similar interests. And from Jim, we learned a lot about the basin, especially the most beautiful area on the east side near Grand Lake, and met a bunch of people that lived out there and fished out there, and made a lot of friends that were great, fishermen. Learned a lot from them. So before we go on, though, I just want to mention that we had a flood event in Lafayette where the Surrey Bridge went 2.5 feet above flood stage. It's still slightly above flood stage. We looked at the water coming down. We have Washington running at 3,000 cubic feet per second. The Vermilion is running at 2,000, and we got 1,000 going down to Teche. When we get down to Abbeville, we're moving at 3,000. So it's kind of interesting that the entire flood system is coming almost mostly through Lafayette. There's no water going over the weirs at Catawba, and there's no water going into the basin. So of this flood, about 70% is coming through the Vermilion, and that's a matter of concern because it keeps it high and makes us vulnerable for future flood events, like in the next few days until it goes down. So if it's at 5 feet and it goes up 5 feet, it's not a problem. If it's at 10.5, it goes at 5 feet up, you're going to have water in people's homes. So that's our concern. So Jim, tell us what it was like in the 50s. Your parents ran a restaurant, and I'm sure that some of what you harvested went to the restaurant, maybe crawfish or crabs and so forth, and what it was like living in the basin before the big dredging event of 58 through 62, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, my parents owned a restaurant in New Iberia, and through that, I was able to meet some people that worked in the basin either for fun or for profit, and I was able to experience a lot of the basin for the last half of the 1950s, 55 to 1960. And that was the time when things were beginning to be dredged. The distributaries from the Atchafalaya River was starting to be plugged, and the channels were different. You could still cross the basin. If you knew where to go, you could still cross the basin east to west, but that was coming to a close also.
Yeah, the attempt was to close every outlet from the main channel to the side swamps. Now, before the dredging, 50% of the flow went down the side swamps. And the goal was to concentrate 90% of the flow, which actually today is 93% of the flow goes through the main channel. So that had an enormous impact on fisheries and water quality. And, entire lakes were filled. Hydraulic spoil, we had 28 dredges, the largest on Earth, that operated for 4.5 years from 1958 to 1962. they closed the Grand River. Grand River started at Butte La Rose, right near Carl Island, and it went kind of southeast into the swamps around Burtonville and on into the bayous that drain into Terrebonne Parish. It went into those lakes, and then by Black, by Kokoda, by Buff was the distributors past the Grant. So the levee shut that off, but also when they did the super dredging, the spoil generally went on the side, and then it flowed out in all kinds of directions, filling every lake and every channel, and it was a paradise lost. As that changed, it drastically changed. You couldn't fish where now it was a hill of sand. It affected wildlife, affected a lot of things. Jim, you might share your thoughts with that.
Well, yeah, it definitely did. I can remember when I was a student at UL and fishing on the weekends. One weekend, I decided to go and fish in one of my usual places, which was a diversion from the main channel. And I went up this small bayou, expecting to get to where it connected to the main channel, and lo and behold, when I got to as far as I could go, there was no more bayou. There was just a plug that had been put there and shut off the water, which was kind of bad because my fishing depended on moving water, and there was no moving water after they plugged those bayous.
And I can remember Crew Boat Chute.
Crew Boat Chute is what I was talking about.
Yep.
Exactly.
There's a major waterway totally plugged and closed,
Yeah.
which really robbed the east side of river water. And of course, without river water, the swamp water turns to no oxygen with all the decaying vegetation. And right across, or not far from that, was, I guess, the crevasse, the Crew Boat Chute. The
Yeah,
crevasse was the
crevasse.
next. And
Yeah.
then Bayou Thibodeau, I guess, came from the
That's right.
river.
Yeah.
That was all closed,
Yeah.
and where the Bayou Thibodeau went from the river into Grand Lake there was so many mullet there that if we needed mullet for bait for our catfish lines, we'd just run the boat around in a circle, and the mullet would jump in. I need a net to catch him. And he'd get 5 or 6 big mullet. You'd fillet him, make cut bait, and it was amazing. You could set out 100 hooks, and when you baited your 100 hook, you could go start at the beginning, and nearly every hook had a fish. And you share some of that. That was when you had it in the right place, of course. And of course, a good fisherman knew where to put it.
Harold has a way of optimizing things, which may or may not be always complete.
Well, it's amazing that the good Lord selected fishermen as his apostles. You maybe touching on the reason.
We did enjoy setting lines primarily for catfish in those days, and you did sometimes set out 100 hooks and come back and bait them, and then go back to the beginning of the line, and there were already fish
Oh, yeah.
on the line a few hours later.
Of course,
So-
and that, well, not, a lot of times they were the pollywogs, the little yellow cats, and then, of course, you were trying to catch channel cats.
Right, well, the pollywogs, you could always tell where you were gonna get into trouble with pollywogs, because they were always in still water. You always caught pollywogs where there was no current, and it's just something that they like, I
That
guess.
you had it in the wrong place.
You had it in the wrong place, that's
Yeah,
exactly right.
right.
So you would move to where there was current, and there would be no more pollywogs,
Wow.
that's right.
Now, tell us about, there was the Vaughn brothers, I remember, were famous for all their carryings on, but one of them was, they were famous for shocking.
Well,
You always
shocking,
have 2 boats in a row, two boats following each other,
Yeah,
and the boat behind had the big net, because the shock would cause the fish to come up to the surface. I don't think it would kill them.
no, but
But
they
it would
would
bring 'em up.
briefly come up to the surface. And so
Yeah.
you had to, I'm told, you had to dip them really quickly because they would go
Well, I
back
was with
down.
them one day, so
Okay. Well, I didn't want to communicate,
I don't think it was legal.
no, shocking was something that was done by quite a few people in those days because it wasn't difficult. All you needed was a telephone generator and a couple of wires.
Yeah.
And you could make catfish. It had to be fish with no scales.
Yeah,
But
it wouldn't affect bass and all that.
No, but the catfish would come to the surface briefly, and you could do that. We used to have controversies with shockers because sometimes we would put our lines in certain places and we would wonder why for a few days they didn't catch. And so we would go out in the evening, and sure enough, there would be some unwelcome guests there shocking our fish. And one time, if I could tell a little bit of a story, I was with a game warden doing this, and we saw these people shocking these fish. So he took after them. And for people who are familiar with the main channel of the Atchafalaya River, the main channel has big buoys in it that mark the channel for tugboats and things like that. These are big structures, like 7, 8 feet tall and 2 or 3 feet in diameter. And these shockers knew well enough that if they took off in their boats heading it whole wide open at night toward these buoys, and we were behind them, maybe 200 feet behind them, trying to catch them, they knew if they ran right at those buoys and the last minute swerved off, we wouldn't be able to swerve off in time. And we would hit the buoys and sometimes get thrown out of the boat, never seriously hurt, but there were adventures associated with people shocking fish in the basin. Yeah.
Wow. And if, share with us what crabbing was like. This was before nets, and the Blue Point crab referred to Blue Point
Yeah.
in Grand Lake, and they had the most beautiful crabs.
They were gorgeous. They really were gorgeous. They were large and they were clean. There was never any barnacles or any moss or anything growing on them. I'm not quite sure exactly why that was.
I kind of looked into
Okay,
that,
all right.
and in the bays, the principal food of crabs are clams. That's 2/3 of their food, and that's a study in Lake Pontchartrain and a study in Chesapeake Bay, and they both had the same conclusion.
Was what?
Clams.
Clams, okay.
And the Rangia clam, Rangia cuneata, is the shells that we use on our shell roads, as opposed to oysters, use oysters and shells, but it's the Rangia. And you have in the coastal bays, about 99% of the clams are the Rangia clams.
Right.
Now, when you go into the basin, you got about 40, 50 different species of clams, including what they would call the grand goule, which was a soft shell clam. And I mean, when there was a bunch of soft shell clams in the basin that weren't in the bays, and the crabs just were on a feeding frenzy. I mean, they could open, I mean, a Rangia clam, you have to open with an oyster knife.
Right.
I mean, the grand goule is the size of a baseball. I can open it with my pocket knife.
Okay.
So I think that diversity of food supply is what really fed the crabs like crazy, and and generally these probably about 99% males that go way up into the estuary.
They were beautiful crabs, all right.
And and how they fished in those days.
Well, the people fishing crabs would put out lines,
A long line.
long lines with no weights on them, but they would tie bait, usually bull lip, that was cured in salt, And they would put these baits on the line and stretch the lines out for however long they had enough
A
bait.
mile, yeah.
And then when you ran them, you had a pulley arranged on the side of the boat.
You would get off an old washing machine,
Exactly, that's right.
and you'd put the line over it, and
Yeah.
as the line came up, you just put the net under it and caught your crabs.
That's right. So the crabs would come up and you dip the crabs up with a shallow net and dump it in the boat.
Yep.
It was a really good way to do that.
And then I guess later the traps came,
Yeah,
and I think the traps ended up coming from Chesapeake Bay, and I may be wrong, you know, so that was, then of course frogs, tell us about frogs.
well, frogs were common back then,
Oh, yeah.
and perhaps more common than they are now. I'm not quite sure why that is, but anytime during the spring, after rains, or even when there hadn't been rains, there was a chorus of bullfrogs going on almost anywhere you were in the Atchafalaya Basin.
Oh, yeah, you could go down any bayou and catch all the frogs you wanted to put in your ice chest. We could get $1 a piece from the restaurants, so a lot of times to get gas money, we'd, you know, take an ice chest and put a hunk of ice and put some water in it, you know. And,
Yep.
and that was ideal. The cold water would knock them out.
They would chill them down, yeah.
Yeah.
Harold mentioned that I've done some work with archaeology, and one of the places that I do it is the Atchafalaya Basin. One of the things that we found that about 1,000 years ago, there were places in the basin where people harvested frogs a lot, and we find evidence of that. The thing that we found different about this particular location by Pigeon was the size of the frogs that these people were collecting. We think they were the same species of frog that we have now, the big bullfrogs. We think they were the same species of frog. But for some reason, these frogs these people were catching were going up to 5 to 6 pounds apiece.
Wow.
And the frogs that we have now top out usually at 1.5 pounds. That's a big
A
bullfrog.
big one, that's a big frog. yeah.
Big bullfrog. But these people were catching and consuming 5 and 6 pound frogs. And the thing that impresses me is that one frog would be enough to feed a family if you didn't
Wow.
have too many kids.
Yeah.
I mean, a
yeah.
6 pound frog is mostly meat.
It's like a 6-pound chicken.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
sure,
It's mostly
yeah.
meat.
Yeah, yeah.
And we found a lot of evidence of that. We found thousands of these frog bones in certain places in the Atchafalaya Basin. So
Wow.
the frog catching industry has been alive a long time.
Long,
in the
many,
basin.
many, yes, that's right. So, it was good eating a long time ago.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I understand the granivoli has a sweet potato type root that the Indians loved.
Apparently so. I don't know much about that, but,
They almost made the plant extinct.
okay.
But I can tell you, they've come back with a vengeance. I was on a lake a couple of days ago, and the granivolas have really taken over, you know. And I was on the river, let's see, Friday a week ago, and the water was, I couldn't get across the basin. The path across the basin, the water was only 2 inches deep. And then last Thursday I went, and a few days ago, and doggone, the river's up 2 feet. I thought, wow, why did the river rise 2 feet? Then I found out the next day when I spoke to the captain of the Corps of Engineers Mississippi 5, that big super tug vessel, that to go between 6 Mile Lake, which is right around Franklin, to Morgan City, the vessel has a draft of 10 feet, and there was only 8 feet of water. And they elevated the river by opening every gate they could.
Oh.
2 feet
Oh.
to get the boat to the meeting place in Morgan City. And they did it not only by raising the water, but they had a guide boat in front
Oh,
that guided them through, and they went through at idle speed. And so this is the mighty Atchafalaya, one of the deepest rivers, quote, in the world, and one of the swiftest current in the world. It isn't so mighty anymore. It's only 8 or 9 feet deep. Barge transportation in that spot has been restricted to a vessel length of 400 feet with a barge draft of less than 10. So now barges typically load fuel of diesel, whatever, to 12. And so 20% of their cargo capacity is lost, which has a big impact. Now, and I quickly say that's a matter of concern not only for navigation, but we need 100 foot deep in depth to have the Project Flood go through the system. And we don't have that channel capacity, we don't begin to have it. And so that threatens Baton Rouge and New Orleans, of course, and of course, the levees on the east side, I took the liberty of going out with a transit and measuring it, and this is not in any way within an inch preciseness, but certainly within 6 inches. There's spots on the levee that's 11 feet with a 7.5-foot steel tongue and groove wall above it, for a total of 28, and a total of 18, and design height is 28. So a great matter of concern to me is that when the big flood does come, not only if the channel can't handle it, it'll challenge the levees, and you'll have water go over the top of this steel sheet piling, drop 8 feet, and quickly compromise the soil beneath that's holding it together. So this makes the entire economy of Louisiana very vulnerable to a high water event. And a river flood is like not different from a hurricane. A hurricane lasts, a hurricane flood is 24 hours, but a river flood might be 3 months or more. So this is a matter of real concern. I expressed that at a Mississippi River Commission hearing. Hopefully, they will do something to help, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Morgan City, and Houma for staying out of harm's way in a big flood. So, but another thing we want to talk about is the tarpon that we witnessed, in Bayou Long and Bayou Pigeon, and a lot of the fishermen would see these big fish and they say, what are those fish? They would say, they had no idea what they were. And I was growing up fishing around Sycamore Intercoastal, and we fished tarpon. And it's kind of useless, fun to catch, but they were not edible. And so, usually we'd release them, and every now and then we'd take 1 or 2 and take pictures and throw them overboard, which was kind of wasteful, So a lot of tarpon were caught, they were photographed and might be weighed and released, if you could release them. Often live tarpon in your boat, you want to whack them with a baseball bat so they didn't break your leg when they cut loose, So, but tarpon, and the big question is, as I understand, tarpon don't roam up and down the coast from Florida to Texas. They roam up into the river systems to where they spawn and out to sea. So they go in and out, and there's very little movement along the coast, but in and out they go. And when they spawn, the juvenile tarpon spends a year in the swamps that they are born in. And so, the large tarpon have to get into the spawning grounds. And for us, Lake Dotree, all the east side of the basin was fabulous spawning ground for tarpon, as I witnessed and Jim witnessed. But places like by Nepique, by Plaquemine, Brulé, the Mermentau, that entire system off of White Lake, Grand Lake, that entire system, by Lacassine and all, were certainly areas where storm. But the access the tarpon have to those areas have been totally blocked, with dams, with canals, go down the list. Like, for instance, the tarpon could come into White Lake through Freshwater Bayou, the original Freshwater Bayou, through floating turf through the Mermentau system, and also through the coops, they would call it. These were the ditches that went from White Lake to the marsh. And they had many of them, and you could drive through them, not at big high tide, but at normal low tide, you could drive across them because they had a hard sand bottom. And when they built the roads, they closed all these things, which, tarpon we all took for granted. There were thousands of them. We had a tarpon rodeo in Cameron. In fact, the high school in Cameron is called the Cameron Tarpons. We had a fishing rodeo at Inacosa City. That had the record of the number of tarpon registered in any tarpon rodeo in the Gulf, where 89 tarpon were registered in one year. This was in the 60s. We had a Sycamore rodeo. We had a rodeo at Homo. We had a tarpon rodeo, of course, at Grand Isle, and the New Orleans Tarpon Rodeo, where the world record tarpon, and that has changed, but that world record was held where tarpon during the New Orleans Tarpon Rodeo was caught in past Manchac. And I understand there are a few tarpons still left in Lake Pontchartrain. In fact, some people are trying to catch them, and they're smaller. But there are a few tarpon too at the mouth of the river towards Fort Livingston and over on that east side. So it's our hopes that at some point a petition can be drafted that would seek to restore the tarpon as an endangered species. Jim has promised to help me with that. But one of the big questions about all this, with all the devastation, I am optimistic, as you mentioned, that nature responds in a wonderful way. When water quality is restored, frogs return. You grow crawfish, you grow brim, and you name it, shrimp. It takes only 90 days to grow shrimp, but it has to be in high quality water. It can't be in zero oxygen water. So restoring it in nature is going to respond. Like White Lake, Grand Lake, a total of about 300,000 or 400,000 acres of marsh, swamplands, and lake that's closed with gates. Now, if it only takes 90 days, the juvenile shrimp come up from the Gulf, and their passing into the marsh is only like an 8 or 10 day event. Shouldn't the doors be open and allow them to come into those wetlands? Just by managing our fisheries resource, without spending a dime, we can improve the dickens out of, and shrimp are eaten by everything. It's kind of like, every owls and hawks and everything eat rabbits. Well, shrimp get eaten by everything. They're the food supply for a long list of critters out there, including humans, And so I am optimistic that managed properly, like open the gates, you open the gates for the tarpon to come in. We may have to go to Florida and steal a few of them to get them going, but I think that's probably, with today's technology and science, that's doable. We restored the pelican. The pelican's pretty easy why we lost the pelican. Not only did we poison them, but we also destroyed their nesting grounds. And the nesting ground in our area was Shell Keys. And these shell islands were way offshore. There's no predators could get to them. And the shell dredgers dredged up Shell Keys. Well, they didn't do it exactly. This is a national wildlife refuge. And the managers here in Lafayette allowed the dredging in that national refuge within 100 feet of the pelican nesting grounds. And they dredged holes 30, 40 feet deep right next to the exposed shell islands that had no vegetation. There was not any kind of vegetation whatever on these things. So it was a fabulous nesting ground, and we destroyed that with shell dredging. That was unbelievable that Wildlife and Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife approved that. They want to blame chemicals somewhere out in, from Tennessee, and that played a role because it affected the thickness of the eggs, and, when the mama sat on the egg, it broke the egg, so that was an issue. But even with that, I would think had the nesting grounds been preserved, we wouldn't have lost the pelican. And so lessons learned from all that, we kind of mess around with nature. We were talking earlier about snakes, and I mean, it was unbelievable the snakes you had in the basin. Now, in the last 3 trips to the basin, I haven't seen a snake, and I haven't heard a frog. Frogs, and frog can live anywhere, but for a tadpole to survive, he's got to live in good water for about 4 or 5 weeks. If you get 0 oxygen in water, all the tadpoles are dead. And so that's the issue. Frog can live anywhere. I can put him out here on the parking lot. He's going to live fine, but he's not going to make it. The tadpole's not going to make it, and I think that's kind of the canary in the mine. You go into the marsh and you don't have any frogs. I remember canoeing at night in a basin, and only a few spots as you coming down in the summertime did you hear frogs.
Yeah.
And again, frogs are, real good eating, but frogs are also the food of bass and, goggle eye, you name it. I remember how much we'd catch goggle eye perch. And I can't tell you the last time I caught a goggle eye.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Okay.
you catch goggle eye constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, sac-lay too, the white perch. Now, there's a couple other things I want to yak about. Okay, we talked about crawfish, and did y'all use nets at all for crawfish back in those old days? You didn't have, you had just chicken wire nets, I believe, huh?
Yeah, it was a wire net, wire traps,
Yeah.
yeah.
And did y'all ever have a feeling that y'all could have done something about what was happening with all these dredges? Was there ever any public hearings? I mean, you're an
Well-
educated person. If there would have been public hearings, I think you'd have attended and would have been voicing concern.
I would have, but the thing about it was that it was difficult to know in those days, in the late 1950s. It was difficult to know what could be done about it.
Yeah.
There were no avenues that were obvious, that were available to people to voice concerns
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
We watched these dredges plug up all of the distributaries from the Chaffalaya River.
All the
we-
way down from,
We
yeah,
watched them do it. I mean, nobody thought that this could be something that would be detrimental. But of course, it was, and we
it
only
was horrific
realized that it was detrimental
after it's
after
done.
it was all done.
Yeah.
So I
You
can't,
take like 2 o'clock by up on above I-10. You go into that, I mean, that's a whole dead water zone. It's totally disconnected from the river. And you got big barge terminals, docks and barge terminals with big tanks. When that was done, they had to build roads. And they didn't build bridges. They came to a bayou, they just built a road over the bayou. It was horrible. I mean, great areas for fishing. I mean, we fished in there before, when it was open to the river before, and it was fantastic fishing in there.
yep,
And in those days, the rise when the river was falling was when the water, or when the tide was going down, was when the fishing was best. You'd find these little coolers going into the main bayou, and you'd find where the water was mixing, and this mix, and you could just anchor your boat and just catch fish till you were tired. Nothing to catch 100 to 200 bass in an afternoon.
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. It was amazing. Like Harold said, the key to that was finding these runs of water coming out of the swamp when the water in general was falling. And these bass would congregate at the mouths of these little runs, and you could park your boat 100 feet, 60, 50 feet away and just keep catching those bass at the mouth of those little outlets.
Catch 50, 100 bass in one spot.
Yeah.
I remember fishing, I was on leave while I was in the service, and my brother and I were fishing, and I had to learn to use the worms. You didn't catch many fish in Georgia, but, and I don't know what he was using, but every cast I was catching a fish with these worms. He said, "That's ridiculous. You might as well just use dynamite." And we ran into Mulot, and Mulot had a real nice chair and a 16-foot pirogue that I guess somebody, beautiful cypress pirogue, and you kind of sit in a little back of the middle, you know, and he used a Dalton Special.
Yeah,
And it kind of simulated a mullet.
yeah,
I think that's what it looked like. And the water was real clear, and we must have had 100 bass, maybe more. And when Mulot had outfished us, the boat was 16 foot long, and he had a rope of bass 16 foot long.
yeah,
It was as long as the boat.
yeah,
It was unbelievable, the fishery that existed there, you know. And I didn't think, we're not aware that it could all disappear, that, you know. And the big question is, how much of it could be restored? Like Henderson was phenomenal. I mean, I remember as during the war, you couldn't afford, you know, rods and reels during the war. He'd make rods from car antennas.
Really?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
And then would solder the guides, you know, and I probably still have one, you know, but of course cane pole, and you couldn't afford red and white bobbers, so you got corks from bottles, and you just split them, you know, and then you'd go back in the leaves and dig up a can of worms, and it was nothing to go to the Henderson levee and you know, catch 150, 200 brim just in an afternoon, just fishing from the bank on the levee. There was an old place we called the Cattle Pen, and it was it would be above I-10, maybe 200 or 300 yards right now, and the pen was kind of in the water, but right near it, it was unbelievable brim fishing. And of course, bass fishing was unbelievable around Henderson too. What was that bait they used? There was a spinnerbait they used a lot, and I'll think of the name of it anyway. But bass fishing was unbelievable at that time in Henderson. You had schools of bass. You'd see schools of bass. And of course, barfish too. Barfish was unbelievable.
Yep.
I mean, the barfish on the river, you'd find the sandbars on the river, and you'd have barfish just jumping everywhere. And you'd have barfish, you'd catch every now and then a redfish, every now and then a flounder, and stripers. And they still have those, but not the numbers that they used to be. And of course, we mentioned the blue crab. That haven't been in the basin probably in I guess the last 6-7 years.
Probably,
Yeah,
that's probably
yeah,
right.
right. Yeah, and you know, it would be interesting to do a little research project, and I think that's what we have grants for. And say, why aren't the crabs coming back into Lake Falls Point? You see, Lake Falls Point would be so full of crabs. I'd send out 10 traps, and I would have 15, 20 dozen in 10 traps. It was unbelievable. Now you can't, I mean, I can go put traps out there, but you're lucky if you catch 2 crabs per trap. And I don't know what has changed, other than the outlet to the bay has closed in, and I think that may be the culprit.
For Lake Forest Point. you
Lake
mean?
Forest Point, the jaws, you know, where the Sheraton Canal goes into the bay. There's a little bitty channel way over on the east side that the crabbers have marked with poles. So they could, you always use the same path, and they self-dredge, I guess. They prop
Keep it
dredge it.
cleaned
They
out?
keep it cleaned out, yeah.
Yeah.
But you couldn't take a crew boat or anything like that through it, you know. So change, the phenomenal change, the 28 dredges, one operation was filling the Grand River at Butler Rose. It was 70 to 90 feet deep. It was about 800 feet wide, and they filled that thing on both sides. You see, the pilot channel is dredged across it, and so they filled it on both sides, which took like a week of 3 or 4 of these dredges pumping, and the material pump was 20% solid, so how much filthy water went in every direction. And it's kind of interesting that we didn't have lots of sand in the basin, I guess, until that occurred. The river, of course, had sand in it, but the side swamps, you know, just, you know, not a lot of sand. But when they reached 50 feet, everything from 50 feet to the 100-foot level was solid sand, and across that whole system. So, and at the meeting in Morgan City, I was concerned. The Whiskey Bay Pilot Channel is a canal that was originally dredged in like 1929, and it was dredged 300 by 50. And then the Super Channel was 1,000 by 100. So enormous difference in size. So we have a call. You on the air? Can we help you?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Dr. Delahousie, could he comment on the on winning the Carolyn Dorman Award for the Louisiana Naturalists Association and what all was involved in that? I'd be interested. Thank you.
Thank you for asking, Roger.
Well, yes, that was definitely a once-in-a-lifetime experience, as you'd expect it to be. I was completely surprised, and Bob Thomas was associated with that organization, and he told me about it, and at first I wasn't really sure what it signified. And then, as I read more about it, I was amazed at the amount of research that is done to try to find people who have a broad impact on Louisiana natural systems. And so I was very surprised and very pleased to receive that award. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, and congratulations. And that is, I guess, this year's award is 2022. So congratulations. A lifetime of, you know, working in nature. And you know, it's great that your fondness for nature brought you into an education relating to nature. And you spent 10 years in the basin fishing right out of college, and during college. Kind of share what that was like.
Oh, my goodness. Well, yeah, coming out of graduate school, one of the things that I was really interested in was how could I apply the things that I had read, I studied in graduate school and so on. And then I discovered that the Atchafalaya Basin had fishermen in it that had been fishing for 3 generations. And it occurred to me that if I could get some of those folks to talk to me about how they made a living, I might actually do that myself, at least on a much more shallow basis than they
Now,
did.
that didn't include shocking.
Well,
This
no.
is illegal fishing.
No, it didn't include shocking, but it included a lot of stories about people who did shocking. And how they made a living at it, and how they didn't, and how they influenced the catfish that the hook fishermen were trying to fish. There was a lot of animosity between people who were shockers and people who were,
Legally fishing,
yeah, legally fishing,
because
exactly.
they shocked the area where you in, it knocked your fishing out.
Well, the fish would leave. If there was shocking going on in an area, the fish would leave, at least temporarily. And you had to move your lines. So it was a problem. Of course, shocking took place at night, and line fishing usually took place in the daytime, so most of the time, shockers and the legal fishermen didn't meet, except by prearrangement. The game wardens would find out where the shockers were operating, sometimes from the legal fishermen. And that led to confrontations sometimes. Anyway, it was a different time.
And people took law in their own hands. It had to be tough for game wardens back in those days, because they all carried guns, and they were not afraid to use them.
Well, everybody carried guns.
Oh, yeah,
I
we
mean,
did too. We didn't go anywhere without our .22 rifle.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. So there was always that potential for a more serious issue to take place than you anticipated, yeah, right?
And I remember the guy around Morgan City who constantly bragged at the bar that he caught more crabs than anybody else and he didn't own a crab trap. So he
Yeah.
constantly robbed. Well, they found him at Plum Island Point with about 40 bullet holes in him. And, you know, I mean, it was just, you robbing people's living. It's like picking up somebody's crawfish trap or picking up somebody's crab trap or picking up somebody's line. You know, you see a line, a bush line jerking, and somebody go pick it up, and you're stealing from somebody's table. You're robbing them of their livelihood.
You know, it's interesting, you hear that all the time, that people would be legal fishermen and somebody would come along and illegally, in effect, steal the fish.
Yeah,
from the
off
legal-
your lines.
Yeah, and I always laughed that the fishermen would tell you, they didn't have to do that. If they just asked, I would have given them the fish, and that was not necessarily true.
Yeah.
They like to say that, but people were a little bit more possessive than that about the fish that they were catching.
And I would say that statement, you know, often when we fish and where we were using shrimp for bait, we'd go up to a shrimp boat and, can you give us some bait? We'd hand them a 5-gallon bucket and it says, just a handful, you know.
Yeah.
They'd fill the bucket.
Yeah,
You know, you'd go home and have more shrimp with it.
Yeah.
So the fishermen were very, very generous.
yeah, that's right.
And it was amazing the knowledge the fishermen, and you might share that with us, who lived in that swamp, how they knew about fishing, where they put the hoop nets, you know, all where they put their crab lines, where they put their crawfish traps, you know.
Well, this knowledge that they had, this was not random knowledge, if you can think of it that way. This knowledge came from sources that were long capable of making a living doing these things.
Generations.
Generations, exactly. So if you were lucky and you knew people like that who were willing to share that kind of information, you had a chance at making a living doing these things. I was lucky because I did have that chance, because I did know people who could share with me. But,
Like old man Rudd Gaujon.
Rudd Gaujon was a character. He was a Falstaff distributor guy. He ran a truck in New Iberia and delivered Falstaff beer to my father as well as other
That's
places.
how you got to know him.
That's how I got to know him. And
Wow.
he agreed to take me into the Atchafalaya Basin. I was probably 8 years old, and to share with me the things that he did.
Wow.
It was interesting to me that he wasn't particularly happy about it. But my father would give him like $20 a week in order to consider taking me with him out in the basin. And when I found out that my father had paid for to my education in the basin, I was not happy with my father, because I thought Rutgajan did this out of the goodness of his heart. And he may have done some of that way, but it kind of took the joy out of it. But
Well,
I
he was probably helping Rut pay for the gas
that's
and the
what he
food
said.
you ate.
That,
and, yeah,
that was,
it
that was,
was
the,
considered on the part of your dad.
that was the story, exactly,
sure.
exactly. But Rutgajan, I have never met anyone like him, although I'm sure there are many others who had the kind of background. But he knew more about the Atchafalaya Swamp than anybody I ever met, and that included so-called educated people.
Wow.
He,
They knew where to hunt squirrels.
oh yeah,
They knew where to hunt deer.
he would take, the whole time I was with him, I would just kind of be appalled at
What he knew.
the things he knew, the things he knew to do, the stuff that he knew.
He could make his own nets.
Oh, absolutely, he could make his own nets. He sure could. But anyway, he was an extraordinary human being. He truly was an
I
extraordinary.
remember him barely.
You do remember
Oh,
him?
yeah.
Yeah.
I had met him.
So he was, like I say, he was a Falstaff beer delivery guy. He was something else.
And there was some outlaws around New Iberia. There was a guy, he'd hunt deer all year long. and he used a carbine. He used a 30 caliber carbine.
Yeah.
And he'd hunt night and day, and he would horn in on the deer hunters that had dogs, and he'd go take a stand, and he'd get them any way he could. You on the air? Can we help you?
Yes. Can you hold on a second? Let me turn this show
Yeah.
off so I can talk. Can you comment about y'all talk about water quality? Can you comment about the quality of water that comes down the Red River and through the Old River diversion from the Mississippi? Because it seems that if that water is not of quality, that trying to improve the quality is going to be very difficult. Can you talk about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things that we all knew, if we were in the basin a great deal, is the Red River is called the Red River for a good reason. That is, that every time you had a lot of rain on the Red River and the water was coming down that into the basin, into the Mississippi and into the basin, the water would drastically change color.
Oh, yes.
It would go from a normal muddy tan color to
Bright
a
red.
bright red color, and it would stay that way as long as most of the water that was coming in was coming from the Red River. I'm not sure how much pollution might have been involved with that, but it certainly changed the color and the sediment that was being carried. Of course, that was what was red.
Yeah.
Would be enormously effective in changing the whole river. But
I can remember when that would occur, and it kind of changed the fishing, because there was usually a flood coming, and where you would catch fish would change drastically.
yeah, it was interesting. Most of us who fished commercially, we certain times of the year we would fish shrimp from shrimp traps, freshwater shrimp I'm talking about, for bait, and or we would put bushes in the river and dip the bushes with big dip nets to catch.
He's talking
these-
about willow branches you'd put on a pole, drop it in the river. And
Yeah.
then you'd just lift it and shake it with a net under it, and you had, you'd have a half a gallon of river shrimp at each pole.
If you were lucky, you did,
Yeah,
yes, that's
yeah.
right. So, one of the interesting things was, whenever you would be having, for instance, you would be having trouble catching enough river shrimp to bait your lines any particular time, and you would get what we call a Red River rise. All the water would change red, and all of a sudden, there would be millions of shrimp available in the traps, in the bushes, for as long as that water had that red sediment in it. and the sediment would go away, and the shrimp would go back to normal, for whatever reason.
Wow.
It was,
And I wonder what, I haven't, do we have river shrimp in the river anymore?
oh, absolutely, but I've been interested in.
Well, you
river
live
shrimp.
on the river, so
Yeah,
you would know.
I do, yes. I don't catch them that much anymore because I don't try. But I'm sure there
you
are a lot
could.
of river shrimp in the water. But until until 10 years ago, the life cycle of the river shrimp was not known to science. It was surprising because something that predominant in quantity would not be known as to how it reproduced. And I was able to combine information with UL, the biology department at UL. And we were able to, over a period of 3 years, we were able to determine how the river shrimp reproduced.
And how they, we're kind of at the tail end, so tell us how they reproduce.
Oh, well, these shrimp go and they reproduce in the estuaries